Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for a discussion about such a critical topic, a historic moment in world politics, world conflict, and world humanitarian issues as well. I have two incredible guests with me today that you all will probably are familiar with, but I'll read off their brief resumes anyway. Alexander Vindman, the former director for European Affairs on the National Security Council, and a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, and an author of a book we will talk about because it's very relevant to this conversation, The Folly of Realism. And Suzanne Malveaux, the CEO and president of Malveaux Global Media, former CNN anchor and White House correspondent, who's been spending a whole lot of time on the ground in Ukraine. So we'll have this sort of policy perspective from Colonel Vindman here, and Suzanne will give us the on-the-ground realities that Ukrainians are facing every day. I myself was born in Ukraine. I immigrated to the U.S. when I was 7 years old. I still have family over there. I worry about them every day, and I'm hoping to learn some stuff from the two of you that might be helpful for myself and others like me as well. Let's start with sort of setting the scene right now of where we are on the path to peace. How far along that path? What are the roadblocks still? What are sort of the main obstacles we're seeing, especially with the change of the administration?
Thanks, Dasha and Suzanne. Happy to join you here. I think we have some significant setbacks, frankly, as a result of the Trump administration adopting a approach. It's hard to call it a policy that amplifies the worst mistakes of the past. So the book that you referenced, The Folly of Realism, really takes a look at 6 different administrations, Republican, Democrat, and how they conducted themselves with regards to Russia and Ukraine, buying into Russian exceptionalism, succumbing to misplaced hopes on how much could be accomplished with Russia, and fears that both arrested our ability to redirect, constrain Russia, as well as support Ukraine in their struggle to transform and integrate with the West. So that feature, this amplification of the worst mistakes of the past, inherently is going to set back the cause of peace. There was a point in time, multiple points in time, I think, since the start of the war in February 2022, where the previous administration could have had a much more kind of robust approach in supporting Ukraine, and missed some opportunities.
The Biden administration.
The Biden administration missed some opportunities to support Ukraine in a way that maybe would have thwarted Russia in its desires to continue a war for years on end at a high cost, and settle on this very kind of, almost. I wouldn't even call it a strategy, this kind of brute force approach of attritional warfare, leveraging Russia's size and power to continue to squeeze Ukraine. So what have they accomplished over the course of these 3.5 years? They're taking small chunks of territory, but Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. At this rate of advance, they don't fundamentally threaten Ukraine as a sovereign, independent state. And the driver for continued war at this point is not necessarily successes on the battlefield, even with this attritional warfare approach, because it's grinding. The Ukrainians are taking losses, but are inflicting massive damage on the Russian military. 1,000, 1,500 casualties a day, according to the Ukrainians. Over 1 million casualties, dead and wounded, severely wounded, in the course of this war. It's partially the fact that the Trump administration is delivering all sorts of accommodations, all sorts of gifts, driving wedges between the U.S. and its traditional allies, whether that's Ukraine or the Europeans, and nurturing this idea that Russia might be able to win in the diplomatic sphere or the geopolitical sphere what it can't achieve on the battlefield. So, unfortunately, the cause of peace is delayed, and the path to peace, which I'm sure we'll get into, would be, frankly, the reverse of what we've been doing, kind of half-measured approach with regards to both Russia and Ukraine for the past 35 years. It's a full-throated strategy. I'm still working on my first cup of coffee to support Ukraine and have Ukraine achieve some successes. And we're not talking about liberating all its territory, but success on the battlefield that allows Russia or compels Russia to negotiate.
Well, we'll talk about how realistic that is, given you've criticized the lack of strategy on the part of both of the this administration and the one before. Susanna, I want to ask you about the feeling on the ground, especially as it relates to the U.S. You know, President Trump said that he would end the war on day one. I have relatives who were very hopeful, relatives in Ukraine who were hopeful for this administration because they are exhausted by the war. They're devastated by the lives lost and scared for their own safety. So what are Ukrainians telling you about how they feel about the U.S., the administration, and what we are doing?
This was my third trip to Ukraine. The first one was back in 1998 with First Lady Hillary Clinton, so I'm dating myself a little bit. But I was there 3 months into the war, and then subsequently just 2 months ago in April. I mean, everyone that I talk to is saying they actually separate the administration, the Trump administration, from the American people. Everywhere where I went, they thanked me. They thanked the Americans. They said, "We are so, so grateful for your support." Their eyes are wide open in terms of their future. They are very war weary. They have a warrior culture, but very war weary. I can tell you, there's some responses and some reactions that are quite interesting. What they would like from us is obviously more support, but they realize that there's a vacuum now and that they're going to have to rely on a European coalition to really help them end this war. But their resilience is really quite remarkable. And I'll just tell a couple of brief stories here, but the people who I met in Kyiv, these are volunteers. These are folks, the men who don't have to go to war to be on the front lines because of their profession or because of their medical condition. So they are on the rooftops of dormitories in the capital, in Kyiv. They are positioned throughout the city, and their goal is essentially to shoot down the drones that escape the defense system. They are the last lines of defense. And I asked them, I had an opportunity, at first I thought this wasn't even real, but I had an opportunity to spend an evening with them on a rooftop. And I asked them, what's your day job, right? What do you do during the day? First one, Supreme Court Justice. Second one, Supreme Court Justice. Third one, opera singer, right? And then there was a jeweler and a retailer. So I was floored. I didn't believe it until he actually showed me his ID, right, and his card. But it's quite incredible when you think about what they are doing. And and they said, hey, we're exempt from fighting, but we are part of this country. We will save our country. The other place that I went to, and I'm sure you're very much aware of this, is Bucha. And obviously that is where the horrible massacre occurred 33 days under Russian occupation. Had an opportunity to talk with the survivors there in Bucha, one of the places where civilians were tortured and raped and killed. And it was just a horrific beginning of the war. And so I met these women, and they've lost their husbands, they've lost their sons, and they need some way to fight for their neighborhood. And so these are suburban moms, these are nurses, these are teachers, and they are out there being trained with these machine guns. I went out with their training guides. They too are there to shoot down the drones because it's grit, it's rage, it's grief. All of it has to be expressed in a way because they will not have their neighborhood taken back again by the Russians. So these are just some of the stories of people who I met who will not give up. They are not going to give up, and they realize that this might be something that they have to live with for years on end.
Yeah. So I just wanted to follow up on Suzanne's firsthand experience. I've also been there for 5 times just since the war started. Last trip was a year ago in April. And yes, it is extremely stressful, as you pointed out, from your family, and oppressive psychologically. But there is no quit. This is a society that's prepared to fight, even if it's. There's no indications. I mean, things could change dramatically if Russia somehow gains the upper hand. There's no indications that's happening. But this is a society that's prepared to fight and defend itself for,
Oh yeah,
for
my,
youth.
my grandmother, who's in her late 70s, living with her sister, and plenty of health problems and all of that stuff. We've been begging her to leave to go somewhere else, somewhere safer where we can know that she's okay. She refuses.
Yes.
Like, she's like, I love you guys, but no, I'm like, this is my home. I'm staying right here.
And you should know, I mean, I forgot to say, but the women of Bucha, the ones who were fighting, they call themselves the combat witches of Bucha. and they,
If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the culture of
they literally have
yeah.
witch patches on their uniforms. A woman with a broom, honestly.
But I
they're
do-
not playing around.
But I do want to ask about the policy here and the path forward, because you have this determined culture of people. However, they are weary, and this has been so grinding and just brutal for families. And I right now it seems like President Trump wants to see a diplomatic solution. I want to know from your perspective, as Zelensky has been asking the U.S. for missile assistance, Patriot missiles, things like that. Are we in a place on the battlefield where a diplomatic solution is on the horizon, or not?
Yeah, we're not. I think it's important to start from the standpoint that Donald Trump doesn't. I don't think he actually has a concept of a plan in this case. He has this wishful thinking about the fact that his relationships with Putin could persuade Putin to negotiate. Putin doesn't feel the same way about Trump. It's
But
not,
he
it's an
said,
unrequited
Vladimir,
love.
stop.
Yeah, I know.
Is that not going to?
Yeah.
That was a big tweet.
So-
Is that not going to come
in all caps, too.
Yeah. Yeah, the war was supposed to finish, more than 100 days ago. But I think the problem here is that Donald Trump has a completely, misplaced view of how this is going to wind down. That it's his personal relationships with Putin that could end this war, where Putin is actually using Trump as in the technical term, as a useful idiot, easily manipulating him, by promises of economic relationships.
That actually is a technical term.
It is a technical term.
in Russian.
In kind of, spycraft or running sources. So that he's easily manipulated based on his character flaws. And, for Putin, it's about seeing how much more he could extract from Trump. And he's mentally prepared, Putin's mentally prepared for this break, where it's, again, an adversarial relationship, but he wants to string along, this hope for as long as possible. So the Ukrainians have incentives to negotiate and end. They're willing to accept, fairly, even if they won't say it publicly, fairly, maybe even draconian conditions, which would mean giving up territory, not in perpetuity, but at least to end the hot phase of this war. What they're not willing to accept is, a pro-Russian regime disarming, completely compromising their sovereignty. So and the Russians want a maximalist outcome. They want the Ukrainians to capitulate. They want these things. They still want to completely subdue and dominate Ukraine. That's part of their intent. So they're unwilling to. Neither side is willing to. Ukraine's not willing to compromise sufficiently. Russia's not willing to compromise at all. The U.S. is taking this kind of accommodating path. So we really don't have, and the conditions on the battlefield are not sufficiently bad for the Russians, as bad as they are, to get the Russians to give up on this hope that Trump and the administration could deliver an ultimate victory in one way or another. So it's the dynamics will stay. The Europeans supporting Ukraine for the foreseeable future, the Europeans and Ukrainians being able to access and buy military hardware to keep them in the fight. Things getting a little bit harder for Ukraine as supplies of military material start to dwindle, but not sufficiently bad where they're willing to compromise their entire sovereignty. And it's going to be another year or more before the Russians, maybe give up on this idea that they're going to get gifted the
Another
ultimate prize.
year or more, that is really difficult to swallow, especially given what you've been seeing on the ground, Suzanne. I want to actually play, if this is an okay time, to play a video of just one of the moments of devastation that you witnessed while you were there. If we could cue that up. This is in a moment where the Ukrainians have been facing historic bombardment of their cities. I mean, we're talking civilian infrastructure, we're talking hospitals, we're talking women and children getting massacred. If we could pull that up.
From my hotel room 6 miles away, and we're now here in this Kyiv neighborhood, residential neighborhood. This is the worst, biggest attack in the city this year. They just got pounded with multiple missiles and drones that killed at least 8 people and wounding close to 80. People here are just waiting now for their loved ones, any sign of someone being alive under the rubble.
At some moment, I heard like a really loud explosion very close. So the house shuddered and shook. I live over there. My house is like pretty undamaged, but I felt like everything vibrating. And so I hid in the bathroom, but in the bathroom, you know, the tiles, they started shaking and some of the fragments fell off. So
This is my house. Він геть увесь розрушений. Все розбите.
It's completely ruined,
поламано.
everything's broken, destroyed.
Страшний удар.
Падали, двері, стекла побилися, всі
doors and
рами
windows
по
broken.
дверях повикручувало там. В общем, наробила такого горя, що тут, ось, бачите, ось
Look at all the devastation and damage.
балкон.
Живе мій знайомий, так скажемо. Чесно, не так близько знайомі, але як більш страшно те, що це міг бути просто кожен.
There
І
are
тут ще й
folks that he knows that were
такі
in this building, potentially under the rubble.
поступки, і мені нема про що ще сказати.
I heard the explosions from And my that's it. hotel room That's 6 miles just a away, loop. and we're now It's the same. Alex, thank you.
Thank you.
We had subtitles.
Thank the
you.
Defense Language Institute.
Yes, I appreciate it. So it was devastating. That was while I was there, and it was the largest attack in Kyiv this year. So far, it's has since gotten much, much worse. But that last young man there, it was a 17-year-old who, a friend of his who was in the rubble with his parents, and they were discovered dead. There was a high school that was nearby, and so I was at the hotel about 6 miles away and had heard the blast, and you know, I was barricaded in the bathroom for the evening. I want to say that it's a very surreal experience in Ukraine now, because obviously it's going on 3 years, and there's a sense of adaptation to what has happened. When I emerged from the hotel, it was a beautiful sunny day. People were going to work, kids were going to school, people were, you know, drinking their coffees. And 6 miles away, you would never realize or never know what had happened just 6 miles away. There is a psychological warfare that is taking place. When I talk to Ukrainians, there's so many methods, so many ways of being alerted and being warned of potential strikes, whether it's on your phone and everybody has an app, whether it's through the hotel, or whether it's just through the alert system in the country. When I was there in the beginning of the war, people would take shelter. They would go to the bomb shelters. Now, you know, it's not something that they really respond to all that much, because they say otherwise we will be defeated. Our lives will be taken away if we are constantly in this state of perpetual alert and disruption. And so that is the way that they are actually coping. I do want to say, to your point about what's next, the Ukrainians say they're not going to give up Crimea. Crimea is Ukraine. It is their language, it is their culture, it is their land. What makes it very complicated to have these occupied areas, Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, is it's been 10 years now that the Russians have basically changed the language and the culture and the education. People basically have been programmed in a completely different way. And so you have, it's a constant battle, it's a fight. But 19,000 young kids have been taken away, kidnapped in Russia, and about 1,200 have returned. But there are a lot of people who are trying to deprogram, to get into those areas and get those kids out and deprogram them. So there's a hot war and there's a cold war, a psychological war happening.
I mean, to that point, my next question for you, thank you for setting me up for that, Suzanne, was at this point, I mean, you've heard Zelensky say at some points that he doesn't want to give up Crimea. He wants to fight for every piece of Ukrainian territory. I mean, how realistic is that given where things are now, and given to Suzanne's point that there are a lot of folks in those areas now that would much rather just see peace and are potentially okay with a solution where parts of either Crimea or the Donbass are either autonomous zones or given over to Russia altogether?
I think I wrote something, I guess, probably more than 2 years ago at this point, saying that Crimea would be the final determination of Crimea would have to wait for another day. It could be a decade or two in the future. When I was in the White House, we drafted something called the Crimea Declaration, modeled on the Wells Declaration. It was after the Russians, Soviet Union took over the Baltic states. We didn't recognize their domination of the Baltic states, and ultimately had a policy to thwart or reverse that. But it wasn't something that we were actively involved in. It was going to take a generation or two. I think that's probably the condition for Crimea. They don't want to give it up. The Crimean Tatars, who had at times a difficult relationship with the Ukrainians, have a much more difficult relationship with the Russians, and that part of the society is not the least bit interested in Russian domination. But the reality is that the Ukrainians don't have the resources, the means to take back and deoccupy those territories. I think the theory of the case would be that in a post-Putin era, when Russia is looking to normalize its relationships with the West, ultimately that day that will come, there's an opportunity for Russia to relinquish control of these territories. I think that parts of eastern Ukraine, the parts of eastern Ukraine that were held since 2014 probably are in the same kind of category. So the best case scenario for Ukraine would be a status quo ante February 2022, where Russia doesn't receive the benefits of the full-scale war, and it has to give up the territories that it's been partially occupying. There's some wiggle room, whether it's a little bit more or a little bit less, but that's in the current stage. I mean, this is war continuing on for another year. The Ukrainians potentially building additional capability to maybe take back territory, could get the upper hand, and then we see more Ukrainian territory occupied. But there's going to have to be a compromise. Some portion of Ukraine is going to stay under Russian occupation, and that's not going to be the impediment for ending at least the hot phase of the war.
And I know people are also talking about the need for potentially a buffer zone, right? Like you see with the DMZ, that there is a model already there that if they could fortify the border like you have in Poland or Belarus, really strengthen that border and then have that buffer zone, that there is some possibility that could work if their military forces were at NATO grade, because they're just not up to speed quite yet. But you know a lot more about the drone situation, which is of course a game changer in this war.
Yeah, I do want to ask about the drone situation, because I had a great conversation with General Petraeus and Ann Neuberger on Sunday about the future of warfare, and they continued to point to Ukraine and what they have been able to do while being so under-resourced, particularly when it comes to their drone program that's now more advanced than ours. They've had to develop and get creative under the gun, quite literally. Can you walk us through kind of the remarkable capabilities that they've developed?
Sure. I think in certain regards, Ukraine, not across all spheres, does point to the future of war, and we see some certain Ukraine had to respond asymmetrically, kind of. So Russia is a heavyweight; it couldn't kind of fight on the same level. So they looked at different tools that they could develop. Drones being a way to respond to the fact that Russia had traditional air power, had overwhelming amounts of armor and artillery, and the response that the Ukrainians came up with was basically drone warfare. And this is going to be a component of the way we interact with, or if we engage in war with both smaller powers, let's say, for instance, a war that continues on in Iran or any other corner of the world, as well as large powers that are looking to invest in the capabilities. Think about what the Ukrainians were able to do with these strategic attacks on Russia's strategic bombers. Significant impacts on what Russia has been investing, for decades and to the tune of billions of dollars in order to maintain this nuclear triad. So it's the nuclear bombers, it's the missile silos, it's a nuclear submarine fleet, and the Ukrainians were managed to, with this one attack, significantly degrade at least one arm of this nuclear triad. And the Israelis are thinking in the same way, in the way they operated with regards to Iran, using drones to cue and destroy different components of Iran's air defenses, as well as target specific command and control sites. So this is a critical component of the battlefield. The Ukrainians have also been pretty fantastic in the way they've planned their intelligence and sabotage operations, everything from the sinking of the Russian Black Sea Fleet to going after critical infrastructure. So, you know, I have to say this from my standpoint as a Army officer and a strategist. I don't think the U.S. is fully prepared for this kind of war. We're prepared for the last war, a conventional war, in which we're going up, you know, with the large armored formations, air power, and some of that might be effective. We'll certainly be able to achieve the kind of air dominance that Israel had, but Ukraine points to a different kind of war that we're not.
Well, and that's where, you know, I've been hearing that President Zelensky and the Ukrainians are interested in helping the U.S. and others learn from what they're doing. I mean, Suzanne, one thing that I, knowing how my grandmother feels about this, like Ukrainians do not like the idea of getting charity, right? Of getting handouts, of being pitied in any way, right? And the idea of how the rest of the world can support Ukraine has started to change, it seems, as Ukrainians have been able to show some of these remarkable capabilities. Like, how are the folks you're talking to on the ground feeling, especially in the wake of the success of taking out some of those Russian bombers, and being able to show that Ukraine is actually fighting in a way that is in many ways more advanced even than the U.S.
Well, Dasha, I went to a facility where they had Ukrainian soldiers, and 80,000 Ukrainian soldiers have lost limbs. This was a state-of-the-art facility where many of these soldiers were in rehabilitation, just trying to survive, trying to live their lives, but also volunteering to go back on the battlefield, right? Because we said they can't win, you know, in terms of a war of attrition, but these are people who want to go back, and they go back multiple times because they need to, they have to, and it's actually hard to get them not to. I met one of the folks who I first met when the war had started, and he was being held in a steel plant in Mariupol, and he was speaking with his wife. They were able to communicate in real time as they were being bombed and attacked and deteriorating. And I met her 3 years ago, and she had a campaign to try to find him. Amazingly so, he had been taken by the Russians. He was tortured. When I was there in April, I had a chance to reunite with both of them. So it was quite a miraculous story that he was able to survive. But his wife has taken on the cause. Women of Steel, they call themselves, and they are all about trying to get the soldiers that remain in captivity. One of the things that they tell me, and they've said it over and over, is like, we will give our blood, we will give our bodies. We're not asking you to do that. That is us. Just support us in a military capacity. They support Zelensky. They accept a certain degree of corruption in the country. They understand that. They're not naive to it, especially the media, that in some ways has really been impacted. 33 journalists in captivity, 330 outlets now shut down in Ukraine. But they support, 80% of the country supports Zelensky because they believe that is their best opportunity, their best shot at diplomacy, at leadership.
To that point, I would love your assessment of how President Zelensky is navigating this moment. Look, no doubt he is in a tough spot between Europe and the U.S. and Putin, but he has had some moments of faltering here, particularly in his relationship with President Trump, which, you know, you can debate what is the right way to deal with this president, but what is your assessment of how Zelensky has navigated this moment?
So we have to remember this is a man that played the part, the character of a president, and that was the way he achieved that office. That's the way, that was his rise to popularity in elections.
That's true.
So,
Not unlike President Trump with the celebrity coming in. Yeah.
Yeah,
Reality
except this
TV.
guy actually played the part of a president.
That's right.
So,
President Trump fired a bunch of people.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, he's well rehearsed for that. So you have somebody that really was playing the part of president when he first came into office, and frankly, that's when I was in the White House responsible for Russia, Ukraine. One of the things was crystal clear to me was this was a charismatic, interesting, earnest individual, but didn't have the experience, didn't have necessarily the tools to be successful. So, you know, when this whole infamous call occurred, it was in context of me building a plan on how do you bolster and help protect this country and prevent a full-scale war that unfortunately still occurred a couple of years later. That was the big issue. But over the course of those, now more than 6 years in office, the first couple of years were he looked quite weak and vulnerable. He wasn't able to achieve many of his components of his platform, whether that's ending the war, full-scale war, or rooting out corruption. After the full-scale war is really when it came into his own. That's where he understood what he had a model for his population strength. That's where he understood that he could use his charm and smarts to engage with the world leaders and rally around something much bigger than just Russia and Ukraine, but this idea of thwarting naked aggression from large states against small states. That's the world order that we've kind of all that the U.S. has thrived on since the end of World War II. So that was obviously, that's where he gets high marks, being able to live up to that role as a galvanizing force within his society and for the world. But there have been certainly missteps along the way too. I think part of the reason that the Ukrainians had some successes early on, but then setbacks were that the president wasn't necessarily skilled at being the commander-in-chief and maybe overly inserted his views on wanting quick wins, and those resulted in missed opportunities, for instance, for the counteroffensive in 2023. So net, the guy has done great, especially if you understand where he's coming from. He's still perceived as a world leader. He's still wildly popular. If he continues to learn from where his shortfalls and shortcomings are, he'll continue to be a great leader with really, because this war is going to continue on and it's anti-constitutional to conduct elections in the context of a war, he'll be the president for another year.
What do you think he should be asking for from the U.S. and separately from the EU?
Yeah. So I think from the EU, he could take the role, continue to play the role that he has from the beginning, that Ukraine is not just defending itself, but it's defending all of Europe and defending Europe from Russian aggression. I think that is a reasonable, and it's now something that's embraced. It wasn't just this divided European view between Eastern and Western Europe, where the Eastern Europeans that were subject to Soviet dominance understood that Russia was kind of an imperial power, had one worldview, and the Western Europeans had a much more benign worldview where they could engage with Russia and do these kind of transactional relationships. Yeah. So he could make that case credibly. To Trump, I'm frankly of two minds. Certainly in this tragic Oval Office meeting in which Zelensky had to hold his ground, he couldn't be a supplicant, he couldn't be there looking weak to his population, to the folks on the front lines, or to Putin. So he played it the way he needed to, push back where he needed to. That was important in that context, but there's also a pattern, the way that the Europeans have been playing to Trump, which is basically pandering to him and flattering him and these types of things. So I think at this point Zelensky has a relatively good bead. He can show the gratitude and appreciation, but also hold his own. And that played out, that evolution, you could see that from the Oval Office meeting that kind of blew up to when they met in the Vatican and had a short but frank conversation.
Extraordinary photo
Yeah.
out of that.
And I just want to add
Magical.
too, like that was really a defining moment
It was.
for the Ukrainians when
Yeah.
they saw Zelensky in that Oval Office meeting humiliated, and internationally humiliated, and that was really a rallying cry for many of the Ukrainians who felt like that they had lost U.S. support and that they needed to pivot.
But
in
it's
terms
the
of
whole
their
world,
support.
actually. It wasn't-
Absolutely, the whole world. And one of the things that we see Zelensky doing is actually making new alliances. We saw him meet with the president of South Africa at the G20, and that is going to be a place that is ripe for new relationships. Russia obviously has had inroads with many of those countries. They're either neutral or they're friendlies. With Russia. That is one place where Zelensky can possibly make a difference and take people out of that neutrality position and say, okay, what do we need to do to get you on our
To
side?
that point, I want to ask you both about this. You know, this conflict is not happening in a vacuum, right? Everything that is going on between Russia and Ukraine has ripple effects outside of Russia and Ukraine, and what's happening outside of Russia and Ukraine is also having effects on that conflict. So maybe let's start with you, Alex, and then you, Suzanne, just walking us through connecting those dots.
So this is a fundamental flaw with the worldview of the isolationists and part of kind of the MAGA landscape that, you know, this is a remote conflict irrelevant to the U.S., you know, thousands of miles away. It's not. It is a conflict that is defining, you know, the geopolitics of this moment and this era, and will have effects for the coming decade or decades. And the reason for that is we have a conflict that, you know, in the military sphere, we're learning a lot about the future of war, and you know, powers like the U.S. which are dominant in pretty much all domains, are going to have to learn from this, because we're going to get attacked asymmetrically by our adversaries. But it is a conflict that's, in part, the conditions that we see, the security conditions that we see in the Middle East today, are the consequence of a 3.5-year war between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has been attempting to foray into kind of build its influence in the Middle East for decades. They actually achieved some success in 2015 when they bolstered the Assad regime. But by being bogged down in this war between Russia and Ukraine, they were spent. They didn't have the resources to either bolster their proxies, these terrorist organizations that Russia and the security apparatus has had relationships with for decades. They were not able to step in and bolster the Assad regime that quickly unraveled. They were not in a position to bolster or have any impact on Iran, another critical ally for them in the region. So we have a transformed Middle East as a result of the Ukrainians being able to bleed out the Russians. I think the consequences on whether Russia is successful or is compelled to end this war without any measurable gains will define what happens with regards to the Pacific, and whether China seizes on the moment to reunify, to realize its one China policy and seize Taiwan. I think the fact is that the Europeans understand, and we kind of started with this idea of the Eastern Europeans understand Russia as an empire, that if the Russians suffer a loss in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, then maybe their aspirations to continue empire building, not just in the former Soviet Union, but frankly, the way they influence the Eastern Europeans, that project ends. So this is a geopolitical earthquake that occurred in 2022, and we're seeing the significant aftershocks still play out across the world. So from the U.S. context, we could either help drive the vital national security interests that we want, which is a Russia that is less aggressive, a China that understands the consequences of outright military aggression, and Russia's ideas of mischief making, driving hybrid warfare around the world, or we could take this accommodating approach that the Trump administration is doing, and hope and pray that things kind of turn out in our favor. They did turn out relatively well, with Israel kind of eliminating a lot of the proxy terrorist networks of Iran, and Iran is less of a threatening force in the Middle East. But that that is not something that we should be sitting on the back end. We should not take this lead from the if we remember this term, we should not be leading from behind, which is something that that Trump criticizes, some of his predecessors for.
Well,
I want to
Suzanne,
weigh in on this.
yeah.
I do think that the situation in the Middle East complicates a lot of things. We have, with the Israeli and Iran war, the Iranians are the ones that are providing the Shahed drones. And if you can cut their capabilities because they're providing it to the Russians, then it makes things, it eases things when it comes to Ukraine. But the other thing, too, of course, is that, when we talk about sanctions, Russian sanctions, it hasn't not been successful. And the Middle East, again, when you have the spike in the oil prices, how are the Russians can benefit from that because you have so much turmoil in the Middle East. And they're able to find different partners around that. The final point is that people in America, in the United States, obviously were very war-weary. And the attention that's being paid to Ukraine, it waxes, it wanes. I mean, it's very, unpredictable. When I was there 3 months into the war, and we were saying goodbye to the Ukrainians, some of our fixers and people who were helping us, they were crying because they realized, at the time I was with CNN, we were packing up our tent, right? We realized that it was going to be a long-standing war, and Americans' attention for any of this is so narrow and so unforgiving in some ways because you have Gaza, because you have Iran, because people are not paying attention really at this moment.
But that's a failure of U.S. leadership across multiple administrations to not make the case for why Ukraine is singularly important to geopolitics.
And
writ
think
large.
about it. I mean, after 2014, the first invasion. I mean, that you had a window of opportunity. There was a window of time where there was very little engagement from the United States, the UN,
But at
or
this point,
NATO.
people have even forgotten that that 2014 was the precursor
That happened.
to all of this. I mean, I don't think the story, and that's on the media as well. I don't think the story that you both are telling of the connectivity of the significance of Ukraine to so many other world events and the future of really global political order. I don't think that story has been sufficiently told, but I do want to give a few minutes for some questions from our great audience here. Let's, that gentleman in the glasses, wait for a microphone, we'll get you.
Hi, could you tell us a little bit about conditions on the ground in the occupied territories of eastern Ukraine? Is there a resistance or Russian troops preoccupied managing that situation?
I can tell you about what's happening with the Ukrainian people in those occupied territories. The Russians give you 90 days, give the Ukrainians 90 days to claim their home. If they're not in their homes, they're sold to Russian families. The people that are there have been beaten into submission, and where their identities are taken, they are forced to speak Russian, to go to schools, and essentially their whole Ukrainian identity has to be squashed. One of the things that they do in terms of, when I mentioned before about taking the children in Ukraine, they prey on the children whose fathers are on the front lines or who have lost their fathers, those who are have some sort of disability or in some sort of facility. They take those children. Those children are in those occupied territories, and they are being brainwashed into becoming Russians. One of the things that people right outside of the occupied areas are doing now is these rather secretive missions where they have people trying to go into the occupied territories and take those children back. And it's a deprogramming operation. But their whole lives have been disrupted, and the reprogramming is hard because I think some Ukrainians are debating whether or not is it possible even in those occupied territories. Let's say they get them back. Do they have the people? Do they get the Ukrainian people back, or have they become Russian? And that's one of the things that is very, very strong in their identity, is that they have to remain Ukrainian and not Russian. it just complicates.
Well, and that's an area that's had a complicated history anyway. I mean, a lot of those folks in those areas grew up speaking Russian. That doesn't mean they didn't identify as Ukrainian either. But the politics of language is also extraordinarily complicated there, especially, you know, in the midst of this conflict where I think a lot of folks in those regions in particular are incredibly battle weary and just want peace for their families, and have had the luxury of identity politics kind of beaten out of them by battle. Let's do green hat right there.
First, I wanted to say thank you for both of you for the way you serve our country, and I appreciate you. Okay, and I definitely support Ukraine's resistance. But what I worry about is the President Biden, I think, received fairly bad intelligence at the beginning of the war, in that they perceived that the Ukrainians wouldn't last 1 or 2 weeks, and he acted in that manner, in some manner, in the early parts of the war. I read the New York Times. I view it as the best source of what's going on in the ground that I read. And the tone of their coverage of the Ukraine war front has this tone that the Russians are winning. They're grinding, that they're slowly gaining ground, and they have a strategy that appears to be winning. At least they're going to try it for the rest of the summer. Could you give me, in the best granular way you can, a look at that, that idea that Russia might be winning or losing? Or because I've heard most of my friends who are in your business think that Ukraine's going to hold on and be fine. Yep. But the way you read the New York Times these days, it really feels like the Russians have some momentum.
Sure. So it's frankly the plague of conventional wisdom. You know, yes, there was a direction of analysis and input to the Biden administration at the beginning that Ukraine was not going to be able to hold. But that was actually I was involved in providing in consulting with the Biden White House, also providing a completely different perspective that the Ukrainians, and that was firsthand experience working with the Ukrainians, that they were going to hold out, this was going to be a long war, and that we needed to posture for that, including providing support early. We don't have a lot of folks that really could that understand that part of the world. The nuances have had time on the ground to understand how much the Ukrainians are willing to fight, to resist. What drives the Russians? It wasn't a response to NATO enlargement. It was Russian empire building. So from my standpoint, there's just too much conventional wisdom, very shallow kind of understanding of what's going on. Bottom line is I don't think Russia has the same power for this war that Ukraine does. On that side of the equation, the Ukrainians are fighting for their homes. They're able to grind down the Russians more than the Russians are able to grind down the Ukrainians and even seize small tracts of territory. So this war is going to continue on in much the same way it is right now. The U.S. could play a constructive role in arming the Ukrainians to not just thwart but reverse some of those gains that the Russians are making. But it's unclear where the Trump administration is going to land. So it is not one in which ultimately Russia wins. It's one in which Russia is compelled to withdraw because it can't achieve its objectives, political or military.
We have time for maybe one or two more. Let's do that young man right there.
Thank you all very much. My question is about the interconnectivity between Russia and Iran and China. And you guys touched on this a little bit. But what are some ways in which what's happening in Iran right now, what's happening in Ukraine, what are some ways in which that's affecting each of those parties that might not be obvious to your average consumer of the news?
Well, as I had mentioned previously, the supply of drones. I mean, the Ukrainian people don't call them drones; they call them shaheeds because they are from Iran. And as much as Iran can be degraded in that way, and Russia will have to find other sources, either produce their own drones or find other sources for that. So in that sense, it is in their favor, in the Ukrainians' favor, that that's playing out right now. On the flip side, of course, is that the Russians could have an advantage economically, and the oil sanctions would be less effective when you have turmoil in the Middle East and when you have the prices of oil as they are now, that bolsters Russia. And so there are many different ways in which that plays out that can be helpful and hurtful both to the Ukrainians.
One more, because I know, Suzanne, you also have to run to another session. This gentleman right in the front row here.
Could you give us any intelligence about the actual soldiers that are fighting on the Russian side? Because I understand they're really not Russian. Most of them are of ethnic communities, and there must be some resistance to that.
So I think it's a mixed bag. I think the leadership is consistently going to be Russian. So the officer corps, the more senior folks, the Russians, what they've been trying to do to minimize the internal turmoil is they've been drawing ethnic minority communities within Russia. The preponderance of them are within Russia, from Tatarstan, from Siberian kind of ethnic communities and things of that nature. So like this, they don't affect the Russian population in the larger cities that could be destabilizing. That hasn't been sufficient, actually. So they have to look for human resources from other places. The migrant communities that come in from Central Asia, they're being pulled in. They're actually paying relatively well, so they're able to get the folks that can't make a living in their, whether it's Africa or Southeast Asia, to come in and fight for their war as mercenaries. But those forces tend to not be effective. It looks like, based on how many casualties Russia is taking, and they're depleting all these other populations and pools, they're very well looking at potentially mass mobilization, including of Russians. But that shouldn't mask the fact that lots of Russians are still fighting in this war. Lots of Russians.
We are out of time, sadly. I wish we had so much more. Thank you to both of you. Thank you, everyone.